Well, today we're going to look at the Apostle Peter. Was Peter remarkably courageous or stupendously stupid, reckless? I don't know. In this story, we'll have to see. Now, the Apostle John remembered that Peter took on the entire Roman army by himself with his sword. And Jesus told him to stop. So all the other disciples ran away. Well, not all of them. It says that Peter followed at a distance. Well, there's some idea that maybe John did too, but we're talking about Peter. Peter was going to make good on his boast to never abandon Jesus. He meant it. Well, let's read what happened next. It's in Mark 14, 53 to 54, and 66 to 72. And why did I split them like that? Well, it's because there's Mark's technique of telling two stories that happen at the same time. Scholars call it his sandwich technique. So the split happens, and the story of Peter frames the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. Now, as I read this story about Peter, I want you to think about why he felt compelled to do what he did. Here's what it says. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And there he sat with the guards and warmed himself by the fire, which was the only light there was. Okay, now we're going to move down to verse 55, which is the end of the story of Jesus' trial in front of the high priest. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they didn't find any because Jesus was innocent. So where was Peter? He's sitting down in the courtyard with the guards. Verse 66 tells us, while Peter was below in the courtyard of the high priest, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You were with that Nazarene, Jesus, weren't you? She said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about. And so he went out into the entryway then. And when the servant girl saw him out there, she said again to those standing around, well, this fellow was one of them. Gosh, this woman is like what we call a Karen nowadays. She just wouldn't let it go. Again, Peter denied it. After a little while, those standing around said to Peter, yeah, surely you're one of them because you're a Galilean. Well, I guess all these people were Jerusalemites, and they could tell that he was a Galilean because of the way he talked. He should have kept his mouth shut. But that's Peter. And he began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. And immediately, of course, the rooster crowed for the second time. And then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And Peter broke down and wept. What a sad story. So, why did Peter weep? Well, it's because he loved Jesus. You know, love can hurt too. He had confidently rejected the idea that he would deny Jesus, and yet he did anyway. And why? because he was afraid. His flesh failed him. He was weaker than he ever thought himself to be. It's like Paul says in Romans 7, our flesh, we do things that we firmly decided not to do. So, who knew about this humiliating story in order for Mark to write it down? Well, Peter told this story on himself. It's all the more amazing because by now the Apostle Peter was a very important elder pastor in the Church of Rome and around the Mediterranean. He's a Pastor Peter, we could call him, I guess. And according to the historian Eusebius, who I've enjoyed reading recently, he wrote about 300 years after Jesus, so kind of like somebody writing at the beginning of the colonization of the United States, I guess, something like that long ago. This is what he says. A great light of religion shone on the minds of the hearers of Peter so that they were not satisfied with a single hearing or with the unwritten teaching of the divine proclamation. But with every kind of exhortation, they besought Mark, whose gospel we have, seeing that he was Peter's follower, to leave them a written statement of the teaching given them verbally, nor did they cease until they had persuaded him, and so became the cause of the scripture called the Gospel according to Mark. It said that on hearing the revelation of the Spirit, what had happened, the Apostle Peter was delighted at their enthusiasm and authorized the reading of the book to the churches. Well, around this time, both Peter and Paul were martyred by Nero. So it's a good thing we have Peter's memoirs. It's his preaching in this book of Mark. So because we have that, I think we ought to do like a little recap of Peter's preaching through the book of Mark, just following Peter's story. It started when Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, and he saw Peter and Andrew fishing. He was called Simon at the time, not Peter. And Jesus said, "Come, follow me, and I will send you to fish for people." And at once they left their net and followed him. Later on, Jesus appointed 12 men to be his official disciples. Simon, to whom he changed his name to Peter, which means a rock. James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, and so on through the other disciples. And then, after Jesus had been around all these people for so long, he wanted to know what people thought of him. And then he asked the disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." But to Peter and the others, the Messiah meant a great human king, certainly not God or the Son of God. Mark keeps Jesus' identity under wraps from the characters in his gospel, even though his readers know that Jesus is the Son of God, because that's how Mark introduces him at the beginning of his gospel. So when Jesus spoke plainly about his suffering as he was coming up to Jerusalem, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. That's not what's supposed to happen to the Messiah. What are you talking about? But then Jesus turned and looked at the disciples, and then he rebuked Peter. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." This is what he called Peter. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." The human concerns, of course, were to get rid of this Roman occupation. Then Jesus revealed who he is one day. He revealed it to Peter, James, and John when he took them with him and led them up onto a high mountain. These things seem to happen on high mountains. Maybe that means something. And they were all alone up there. Then he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Oh, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And he didn't know what to say because they were so frightened. Then a cloud engulfed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Peter had misunderstood. He saw these humans, glorified and resurrected, Moses and Elijah, as equal with Jesus. So God says, don't listen to Peter, but listen to my son Jesus. Jesus is God's son, whom God loved. Later, as a spokesperson to all the disciples, Peter reminded Jesus, "Well, we've left everything to follow you." They thought their commitment to Jesus was utter and absolutely complete, without question. How little they knew of themselves. Because during the Last Supper, before Jesus' suffering, Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I sure won't." Peter, the rock. "Truly, I tell you," Jesus said, and shocked them all. "Yes, tonight I'm telling you that this is going to happen. Before the rooster crows twice, you yourself, Peter, will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. How little they knew themselves. And so, after that Last Supper, Jesus went to the olive grove of Gethsemane to pray. He knew what was coming up. He left 8 of his disciples down at the bottom of the hill and took Peter, James, and John along with him further up. He began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "You stay here. Keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed, if it's possible, that this hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to the disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour?" Well, it was something like 3 o'clock in the morning. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Did you notice that Jesus didn't call him Peter this time? He called him by his first name, his former name, Simon. Yeah, Simon wasn't being a strong rock in the grove of Gethsemane. He was as weak as his flesh, as we all are. Mark said that when the guards came from the high priest, all the disciples ran away. All except Peter, that is. Peter continued his loyalty to Jesus, but cautiously followed him at a distance. Then, because he was cold, he grew reckless and went right into the courtyard of the high priest. And there he sat with the guards who had arrested Jesus. He's warming himself at the fire, which was the only light. And so this woman saw him. And we arrive back in our story today. Mark doesn't tell us that Peter was restored by Jesus, as the other gospel do. But it does suggest it with this cryptic comment in Mark 16:7, where an angel tells the woman disciples that Jesus is not here in the tomb. I say womb. Kind of the same thing, I guess, isn't it? Jesus is not here in the tomb. He has been raised from the dead. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Now, as usual with Mark, there are layers in this story. There is the story itself, and there is the churches in Rome and around the Mediterranean. They've gone through severe persecution, and they know persecution has not yet abated. They are the ones who persuaded Mark to remind them of Peter's teaching. I doubt that Mark or the church people in Rome would ever have expected that we would be reading his book and being blessed by Peter's teaching. What is it, like 2,100 years later? But God knew and continues to speak to us through Peter's words via the book of Mark. So what is God telling us in this example of Peter's life? I think it's a cautionary tale. I'm reminded of a cartoon of Calvin and Hobbes I read recently. And the tiger says to the boy, "Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong?" Well, for one thing, it takes an awful lot of humility and intelligence to be able to step back from our certainties like a rock, in order to learn the truth. A truth we had no idea was there. Jesus kept saying, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear, and he who has eyes to see, let him see." Saying there are things that we hear and we see that we do not understand because we've already decided what we think is true. Be careful of our certainties. I think that's the message. Peter and everyone else in Palestine at the time knew beyond a doubt, absolutely certain, what the Messiah would be, and they were absolutely wrong. The truth was far more expansive and far more amazing than anything they had in mind. They had no understanding of it. Jesus, as Messiah, was the Son of God. Yes, he was a king, but not of this world, as he says to Pilate later. And he was the Son of God that wasn't conceived through human means or by the will of a human, but by God's Spirit. You know, the religious leadership in Jerusalem, they only saw this pathetic religious heretic threatening their positions of power and influence and leading the people astray and causing a danger that the Romans will come down on them. Peter was not able to accept that Jesus would have to die, or that his death would be through Roman crucifixion. Peter, feeling in charge as usual, had even tried to deflect Jesus from the plan of God. He had no idea that his certainty came from the same source as what Jesus confronted in the desert when Satan first tried to deflect him from the plan of God. We have to be careful of our certainties. So I think we need to hold what we think we know very loosely. We need to be ready to accept the possibility that our whole understanding of life and our religion, politics, and everything could be so totally wrong. Even if everyone else understands everything the same way, they could all be totally wrong. True Christianity itself is cross-cultural, even maybe cross-Christian culture, depending on where you are. We also need to accept the possibility that our loyalty and confidence in Jesus will be resented and suspect, especially, apparently, by religious people. This is complicated. We need to accept that we may suffer for seeing and hearing real truth. Truths that counter normal assumptions of our culture and everyone else around us. Even religious leaders may be leading people against the plan of God for them. After all, it was the priests who got Jesus crucified. In the prophets, God had accused the priests of considering the people to be meat in their stew pots for them to eat. And I'm afraid that there are some religious leaders today who have the same way of thinking about their congregations. So, that all sounds awfully negative. What are we to do? What standard can we use to see and hear clearly and truly? Well, Jesus has spoken through his words and actions examples of God's plan for us. We need to see what he was doing in the scriptures and take to heart what he was teaching. I think we've forgotten the whole Sermon on the Mount, for example. It's why the Gospel of Mark was written and why Peter endorsed it. So what did Jesus say and demonstrate were the foundations of life, foundational requirements for the dominion of God, which is referred to as the kingdom of God, but we don't have kings in America, so I'm using dominion of God. Jesus went back to the original laws given to Moses and said, it is love the Lord with all your being. He said heart and soul and mind. That means all of you, your whole being. And here's the hard part, because it's rubber meets the road, love your neighbor as yourself. And the story of the Good Samaritan, the neighbor was not someone that they normally would be loving. Yes, he said the foundation of life is love. No exceptions. There are no loopholes to love. Because he said you have to love even people you think are your enemies. Gosh, this is getting harder and harder, isn't it? Well, that's why Peter was weeping at the end of the story. He loved Jesus, and that love for Jesus made him courageous enough to risk his life. But his courage failed. Oh, the failure of love. His love turned to grief when he remembered Jesus' predictions at that Last Supper. He never thought he could deny Jesus. He was certain he wouldn't. His love was that strong. But Peter was weak in himself, because he had fallen asleep. He was not watching. He was not praying for strength like Jesus was. He wasn't looking for how events were developing. He had no idea these guards would be coming up the mountain to arrest Jesus. So Pastor Peter learned from his own experience. And in 1 Peter 3, 8-12, he wrote in this letter how we can be prepared. He says to them, all of you be like-minded. It's hard right there, isn't it? Be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, which is just defined, hasn't he? And his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Oh, at the beginning of his letter, 1 Peter 1:22, Peter told his churches, now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth so that you have sincere love for one another, well then, love one another deeply from the heart. And that's his word to us as well. In 1 Peter 4:8, he says from his own experience that love covers a multitude of sins. The problem is that love can be so misunderstood. All you need is love. Yeah, but what do you mean by that? It needs a definition. Peter knew what love is by having lived with Jesus for several months. And so the life and death of Jesus defines love for us. So Peter tells us then, like Jesus, to love deeply, from the heart, like Jesus did. Amen.